I think what this exercise and other ones like it shows is we all have a way into knowing what it's like to be marginalized. So I'm fairly privileged. I'm white. I'm middle class. I'm well educated. I'm straight. I was raised Christian even though I have a Jewish last name. There are a lot of things I can just count on working for me in the world. In Germany, for instance, because I look like I might be German, people persist in speaking with me. So even when I was first there, and for those of you who know the European framework, I was just on the border between A1 and A2. So I could do some pretty basic things, but I was by no means a good speaker. And yet my experience compared to friends of mine from Armenia or China or South America who didn't look German was very different. People assumed, well, she's having a bad day. Maybe she's drunk. Or, and I don't know if Renee's gone, or a few people said, oh, are you from Switzerland? Because they could tell something was a little off, but they weren't sure. And Hamburg's pretty far away from Switzerland, so they may not have heard many Swiss people speak. And as my German got better, some of you might appreciate and laugh, people either thought I was Dutch or Danish. So, diversity is about identity. And most often, these identities, like mine of having German American heritage, are always a part of us. However, we're not always conscious of our own way of being or these identities. And we're also not always conscious that there are other ways of being. It may be that what you saw was not all there was to see. It may be that you are confusing honesty and integrity with accuracy and completeness. I think having these one-of-a-kind experiences, as icky and awful as they sometimes are, is really a reminder that we don't have the complete picture, and that we may be confusing being honest and trying to live with integrity with having a clear and accurate view of how the world works and who we are within it. And I think one of the great things about Jungian type is it's about trying to navigate your way with honesty and integrity toward an accurate self-assessment and a more complete sense of who we are. Dario talked a little bit about one-sidedness. I think we have to go through that to become able to operate in the world at all. But then we need to recognize that there are parts of ourselves that we are othering, that we are pushing away in the same way that in your stories you were othered by the group. So what might be behind this lack of conscious awareness of our identities or our diversity? Well, the first thing might be the fact that some of them are invisible. So yes, there are some things, as we learned in Jane's session, that might tell you about someone's type from how they dress. You might also learn something about how their house is organized or their desk. But in general, type is a fairly invisible diversity. It's something like your status as a veteran, or your sexual orientation in many cases, whether you suffer from a chronic illness, whether you have literacy skills, whether you can speak a language in my case, whether you're a survivor of abuse or refugee, whether you have spent time in prison. All of these things are important parts of our identity, but often invisible. And sometimes we want to push those parts down and make them invisible even to ourselves. I think the other reason that we might lack a consciousness about them is because we have the dominant identity. When I lived in the United States, as a native speaker of English, my native language was not an aspect of my identity. It didn't occur to me, even when I was working at a university where we had a huge number of psychology students who were not first language speakers of English. It only became salient when the context changed, and suddenly that was a diversity that was important. And I learned about this in a very interesting way. I go to a group called Dialog in Deutsch, and Hamburg has a program to facilitate people who want to learn German to practice and to meet other people learning German. So I sit in groups and I listen to people's experience in trying to learn this new language, and we talk about everything from what is a wedding like in your country? And we have people from all of the 6 inhabited continents, so I've learned a lot about weddings. We talk about, someone brought a question, should you be able to donate both kidneys if it would save someone in your family? And we're handling all of this in, pretty moderate levels of facility with German, but the diversity of opinions, the diversity of backgrounds people bring is salient because I now am in an environment where language proficiency is an important diversity. And I would never have noticed this and been able to value it until moving to this environment. So I think one of the benefits of surfacing these invisible diversities, making people aware of something like type, is that it gives a chance for individuals from the dominant group to learn how they are diverse. So if you have an entire team made up of, let's say, people like me, white, middle-class, female, and you do type with them, the chances are you're not going to have a whole team of INTPs. God help you if you do. I would not look forward to hurting that group of cats. So even though in that group, demographically, I am in the majority, I don't have any diversity in that sense, by surfacing the INTP aspects, my preference for introversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving, I suddenly can see where as a group we are different, where I may be putting my own preferences, INT and P, onto the people in the group who prefer E, or S, or F, or J. Secondly, I think individuals come to realize that diversity is more than skin deep. I think that early quote showed that millennials perhaps already have a leg up on this. When I talk to my niece, who's a millennial, she's actually a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that she's not from a mixed race family. She went to a high school where there were 70 different languages spoken in the home. She has pale white skin and red hair. And yes, her family does have some Danish background. And yet, she often finds that identity to be very salient, which is very different. I went to high school in the same state, and basically we brought in people who looked different than me. There was a group called A Better Chance. No one in that group looked like me, and that was a fun opportunity. I sat with them at the lunch table, but a lot of people, I think, avoided them. So, when diversity is invisible, when we don't have these chances to see people are different from us, like me in high school or like me in the United States, the awareness, the appreciation, and the action required to be more inclusive, they're all pretty difficult. What I'd like to suggest is that type is something that makes diversity visible in some specific positive ways. That there's something special not just about invisible diversities, but about type and the way we work with it. So, to contrast two approaches to diversity. The typical one involves looking out, looking at the visible diversities normally, and focusing on groups or demographics. Things like gender, age, ethnicity. Looking in is typically about the invisible diversities. It focuses on individuals, so things like your life history, and things like psychological type. Under these two approaches, how do we determine who we are? Looking out, the demographic approach, is often just about counting who's there. And this could be a way in which people are using type. We count up there's 8 extroverts, 2 introverts, 3 people with dominant introverted thinking, and so on and so on. But hopefully, in working with type, we're also asking people to look in and to help them become aware of who you are, of who they are. So looking out, I think we typically tick boxes. And there are probably a lot of people, I hope none of them are in this room, who do type in a way that just involves asking people to tick a box for themselves. I think that's what's lost when you don't do an interpretation. When you hear about those times where, say, someone goes for marriage counseling, and each member of the couple is handed their report, and they go from there. I think that's more the box-ticking style. It's really suggesting that, okay, we've given you some information about yourself, but it's more an exercise in labeling, putting people into categories. And I think with type, and hopefully with other sorts of looking in, ideally we go through a self-discovery process. And I think self-discovery, in and of itself, whether it's type or other things, has some real value. So when you have to uncover who you are, yourself, when there's not a test, clinician, some sort of professional telling you your type or assigning you your identity, that's really something that supports our very natural drive to grow and develop and seize on these opportunities to own the results, to recognize this is true for me. And just as a contrast, I was once in a session where someone said, I just got my report, and I was told that because I prefer INFP, I'm really self-aware. And I struggled to see how someone who was really self-aware needed someone else to tell them this. Those two concepts didn't work together for me. It sounded like that report was handed to the person with, here's your type, here's the list of characteristics that flow from it. And the person seemed grateful, but didn't seem to recognize that as part of who they were. I think a second benefit is when you use a self-discovery process, it allows individuals to work in their own way to find their psychological type, to discover their identity. And I worry that as we try and create lots of nice online systems, that we may be losing some of the benefits when we work face-to-face of allowing people to work in their own way. We may be trying very hard to respect all types. We may be trying to create assessments that are going to value everyone equally. But I think because we all have our own ways of doing things, and because there are ways online that things just have to happen, we may lose some of these values that come from allowing individuals to work with us in their own way. And I don't think that has to necessarily be face-to-face, but I think if there's too much standardization without a follow-on conversation, we might be in danger of losing this benefit. think thirdly, asking individuals to make their own choice about what they prefer puts them in control. Not the assessment, not the self-discovery tool, not us as the coach, consultant, whatever our role is. I think a second thing that's really valuable about things that ask you to look in a particular type is that looking out tends to suggest that your identity is static. So while my identity as female and North American has stayed the same, as I move to a new context, the North American piece takes on an additional salience, and my identity as a native speaker of English has changed. So there's something dynamic about identity. And I think type has that built in, if, again, we do it well. So I think in type terms, our self-identification is a journey. And there's no perfect type, nor any perfect realization of a particular preference, function, or attitude. I think furthermore, because type is set up in terms of polarities, whether you look at it from the preference approach or the 8-function approach, the existence of these opposites in a dynamic tension reminds us to think in terms of balance. That each of these identities is important, but we can overdo our strengths. And that can be true if I'm recruiting and I want to have all introverts, or I'd like to have all dominant introverted thinkers. I'm probably not working in a very dynamic way. I'm probably limiting the work my team, my group can get done. I think, too, polarities offer us this both and. In getting to know our full selves, we get some ideas about how we can adapt that style to reach those who don't share it more effectively by looking at intuition, seeing what that brings, and then making sure I check to look over at sensing. How is my style needing to be adapted to take advantage of the fact that I can do sensing? It's going to be more tiring. It's going to require perhaps more preparation and practice. But the benefits that I get, the increase in effectiveness, and boy, as an INTP, I like that, means that effort to adapt, that effort to say both what I do and what works for others is going to make this a good experience. I think that's a special thing about type and this model that we have of interplay and tension. And I think, in general, that polarities remind us that our style is not the only style. For instance, you might assume that the dominant culture is not going to want to hear from you on those things that they don't typically value. But I think this polarity model suggests that there should be this flow, and that failing to share your point of view sells both parties short. Yourself, because you haven't given all that you have to give. The other part, because they don't appreciate what they don't know. You haven't given them an opportunity. Secondly, assuming that they won't care is like assuming that someone who has INFP preferences won't care about the impact on the bottom line, or that someone who prefers ESTJ won't want to consider the impact on people. Very unlikely that those things are true, even if the way we talk about type might suggest that. So that leads us to this idea of a 0-1, our digital identities. So looking out typically implies there's one right way to be, and that's to be like the majority. Looking in, particularly with type, highlights the variety of equally valuable ways of being that exist. So I want to give you an analogy here. So when Darwin was working, he identified a variety of different beaks, and I meant to get a picture for this because the illustrations really tell this story very nicely. But he was looking at the finch species in the Galapagos, and there are a lot of different environments on these islands. And just like these different birds had beak adaptations, which we can't judge independent of the environment of the Galapagos, most of our personal characteristics, our type characteristics, can't be said to be better or worse in the absence of information about that context. So being an INTP in an academic setting, as I was for very many years, that was a pretty good fit. That context played to my strengths. There are plenty of other environments where my beak style would have made it difficult and hard for me. I would have been able to work in that environment, but perhaps I would have had to do it in a way that was very different than this environment that fit my beak very well. I think, too, that using type gives you this speed and stability combination, which in a McKinsey report they talk about that being the basis for agility. So an approach which asserts that there's no one right beak type, nor one right psychological type, allows us to exploit the environments in which we find ourselves. And it helps us adapt to the ever-changing circumstances that we've been hearing about over the last days. So recognizing that it's not one size fits all, when there's no one right way to be, it helps to free people from the pressure to be like the boss, to be like one's parents, to be like an important public figure, and to be the way that comes naturally rather than forcing yourself into those modes, whether it comes naturally or not. I think, in addition, when there's no one best type or preference, and thus no dominant or majority group that we should all be like, no norm, we all have the opportunity and simultaneously the responsibility to recognize, to celebrate our diversities. When we're working toward inclusion, I think the last advantage to type is how much easier it makes this work. So let's imagine scenario one. We've done some work and we find our workplace doesn't support the needs of women. Okay, scenario one, pretty common one. It's been a lot of work. In Germany, there's now a law that says any company registered on the DAX, which is their like the Fortune 500 or the FTSE, must have 30% women represented on the board. Not really the important board, unfortunately, but one of the boards. Scenario two, our workplace doesn't support the needs of people who prefer introversion. Okay. So how easily can you demonstrate a workplace doesn't support the needs of women? What might you do to do that?
So, count.
You might count. So you see that, particularly say at leadership levels, there aren't a lot of women. What else might you do?
Benefits. The benefits aren't there for the women, like childcare or those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
You'd ask women.
Uh-huh.
Because it's easier to see. Like, unless you've done the type of thing, you may not know what good introverts are.
Okay.